caught spying on the Vampire King, the Omega expected death, not a crown. The basement of the Crescent Moon Pack headquarters smelled like stale concrete and broken promises. Ivy sat in the cold metal chair, her wrists bound behind her back, not because they didn't trust her, but because this was how they did things. Protocol. Everything was protocol with the Council. She'd been an Omega her entire life, not the weakest kind but close enough. She had skills they wanted, she was invisible, not literally but in the way that mattered. People didn't see her. Men didn't look at her twice. Women underestimated her. It was perfect for what they needed. Commander Thorne entered the room, his grey eyes unreadable. He was large, the kind of large that made doors seem smaller. Behind him came two council members, Marcus, who had a scar splitting his left eyebrow, and Victoria, whose heels clicked against the concrete like a countdown to something terrible. "Your assignment is simple," Commander Thorne said, circling her chair slowly. "You'll infiltrate Crimson Castle, you'll get close to King Ashford, and you'll find out what he's planning with the Eastern Territories." Ivy's stomach tightened. Ashford, the Vampire King, the one who'd killed the last 3 spies they'd sent. "How am I supposed to get close to him?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. "He's a vampire. He'll smell me before I even reach the gates." Victoria smiled, and it wasn't kind. "You'll be a gift." The way she said it made Ivy's skin crawl. "We've been in negotiations with several vampire clans," Marcus explained, his scarred face leaning in. "They think the Crescent Moon Pack wants to form an alliance. Part of that gesture involves offering them something valuable. A young Omega female, an offering of goodwill." Ivy closed her eyes. She'd known this was dangerous when she volunteered, but somehow she hadn't imagined this specific kind of danger. "He'll keep you," Thorne continued. "It's his nature. Vampires are possessive with gifts. You'll have access to his inner circle, his war room, his plans. You'll gather intelligence on the Ashford Eastern Territory Alliance and report back through dead drops we've established. In 3 months, you'll be extracted." 3 months, living with a vampire king who could snap her neck like a twig. "What if he discovers what I am?" Ivy asked. "Then you'll die," Victoria said simply. "But we have faith in your abilities, Ivy. You've never failed us before." That wasn't entirely true. She'd made mistakes, small ones no one else had noticed, but she was good at her job. She was good at disappearing into background noise, at being the person no one remembered. It was her gift and her curse. They released her wrists. "You leave at dawn," Thorne said. "A carriage will take you to the border. From there you walk to the castle. Alone, a true gift wouldn't arrive with an escort." Ivy stood, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. She looked at each of them in turn, memorizing their faces, their postures. If she was going to survive this, she'd need to remember everything. "One more thing," Marcus said as she reached the door. "Ashford is paranoid. He's been betrayed before. He can sense fear and weakness. Don't show him either." As if that were possible. Ivy climbed the basement stairs toward the pre-dawn darkness. Her small room was waiting for her in the Omega quarters. A narrow bed, a wooden chair, a single window. She'd lived there for 5 years, ever since she'd proven herself valuable. It was the nicest place she'd ever had. She packed light, clothes that would work for a servant, a knife hidden in her boot, not that it would do much against a vampire, but it made her feel less helpless. She touched the small compass hidden in her palm, her lifeline to the dead drops, to her handlers, to the possibility of extraction. Then she waited for dawn. The carriage arrived as promised, driven by a man who didn't make eye contact and seemed very interested in the road ahead. Ivy climbed in without looking back at the pack house she might never see again. As they drove north toward the mountains where Crimson Castle sat like a jewel in darkness, Ivy ran through her training. Stay quiet, observe, remember faces, listen to conversations, don't be memorable, don't be fearful. By the time the carriage stopped at the forest edge, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. "This is as far as I go," the driver said. Ivy stepped out onto the forest path. Ahead, barely visible through the trees, the castle appeared like something from a nightmare. Towers of dark stone pierced the sky. Lights glowed in windows like watching eyes. She took a breath and began walking. The gates of Crimson Castle were made of wrought iron shaped into thorns and roses intertwined. Guards in black armor stood on either side, and when Ivy approached, they moved to block her path. "I'm a gift," she said quietly, "from the Crescent Moon Pack, for King Ashford." The guards exchanged a look. One of them spoke into a communication device at his ear, his voice too low for her to hear. After a moment, they stepped aside. "Walk straight ahead," the taller guard instructed. "Don't deviate, don't run, don't do anything stupid." Ivy nodded and moved forward. The courtyard was vast and empty, lit by torches that burned with an unusual green flame. The castle walls seemed to lean inward, and the stones themselves looked ancient, older than any building she'd ever seen. This was a place of power, a place where normal rules might not apply. A woman met her at the main entrance. She was tall, with black hair braided with silver threads, and her eyes held the flat, knowing gaze of a vampire who'd seen centuries pass. She wore armor that suggested she held rank. "I am Captain Kess," she said. "You will follow me, you will not speak unless spoken to, you will not touch anything unless instructed, you will not attempt to leave. Failure to comply will result in death. Do you understand?" "Yes," Ivy whispered. They walked through corridors lit by those same green flames. Ivy's senses screamed at her to take in every detail, the way the castle was organized, the number of guards, the exits. But she also made herself seem uninterested, bored even, just a scared Omega girl, trying not to think about what would happen next. Captain Kess stopped before a set of massive wooden doors carved with images of battle and bloodshed. "The king has agreed to see you. You will address him as your majesty or your grace. You will not meet his eyes unless he commands it. You will not approach him unless he summons you. You will be gift enough to serve as a companion, but not so forward as to be presumptuous. Understood?" "Understood," Ivy said. The doors opened. Crimson Castle's throne room was exactly what a vampire king's lair should be. Vaulted ceilings lost in shadow, pillars of dark marble, and crimson banners hanging like dried blood. But it was the man who drew every ounce of her attention. King Ashford sat upon his throne, and he was nothing like the stories suggested. He should have been monstrous. The legends spoke of a creature draped in shadow and malice, a killer who'd built his empire on the bones of his enemies. But the man before her was devastatingly beautiful in a way that made her breath catch. Long dark hair fell past his shoulders. His features were sharp and elegant, carved from marble and moonlight. His eyes were the color of ancient amber, and when they fixed on her, Ivy felt like she was being examined at a molecular level. "What is your name?" His voice was soft but carried the weight of ancient authority. Ivy's mouth went dry. This was the moment. She'd practiced this. "Ivy," she said, "Your Majesty. And you are a gift from Commander Thorn of the Crescent Moon Pack." "Yes, Your Majesty." He rose from his throne and descended the steps. Each footfall echoed through the space. He moved with predatory grace, and Ivy's every instinct screamed to run. He circled her and she remained still, eyes on the floor as she'd been instructed. "Do you know what happens to gifts?" he asked softly. "To offerings made by packs seeking alliance?" "No, Your Majesty. They are consumed, destroyed, used until there is nothing left but memory." Ivy's heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced her breathing to remain steady. He stopped in front of her. She could feel the cold radiating from him, could smell something like winter and smoke and old spice. He reached out and she felt his fingers brush her chin, tilting her face up. Their eyes met. For a moment neither moved. Ivy searched those amber eyes for mercy or malice and found herself unable to determine which would greet her. Then his expression shifted. Something flickered across his face that might have been surprise. "You're not afraid," he observed. It wasn't a question, but Ivy answered anyway. "No, Your Majesty." A lie, she was terrified, but she was trained to bury it so deep that even a vampire might not smell it on her, or at least that's what she'd been taught. He smiled and his fangs caught the light. "How intriguing. Captain Kess, have Ivy settled in the eastern wing, see that she has everything she needs." He turned and walked back to his throne, and suddenly she could breathe again. "You'll be staying," Captain Kess said as she led Ivy away. "In rooms adjacent to the king's private chambers. You'll have duties, attending him, serving him, keeping him entertained. Do well and you'll be treated reasonably." Do poorly and you'll become what all failures become here, a warning to others. The rooms were beautiful in an austere way. High ceilings, a balcony overlooking the eastern gardens, silk curtains the colour of garnets, a bathroom with hot water that seemed endless, clothes in her size already hanging in the wardrobe. They'd been expecting her. That night, Ivy lay in a bed softer than anything she'd ever known and couldn't sleep. She thought about the way the king had looked at her, the strange moment when their eyes met. She'd expected coldness. She'd expected the flat, predatory gaze of a creature who saw her as nothing more than a temporary amusement. Instead, she'd seen something almost like recognition. By morning, she began her real work. She memorized the layout of the castle. She learned the routines of the guards and servants. She discovered the locations of the war room, the records chamber, the king's private study. She was invisible again, the way she knew how to be, the girl no one noticed, the one moving through shadows. And she began to gather intelligence on the Ashford Eastern Territory Alliance that could bring her pack to war. 3 weeks passed. Ivy had fallen into a routine that felt almost normal. She attended the king at meals, served him drinks, stood in the background of meetings pretending to be the empty-headed decoration they all assumed her to be. At night, she recorded what she'd learned in a cipher only she could read, hiding the notes in a loose stone behind her bathroom mirror. The Ashford Eastern Alliance wasn't about conquest. It was something else, a mutual defense pact against the Council of Pacts. They were afraid. Even the Vampire King, in all his power, feared the coordination and numbers of the United Pacts. This intelligence was valuable. This was the kind of thing that could shift the entire power dynamic of the region. But it was also a lie. Ivy realized it on day 22 when she overheard a conversation between King Ashford and his advisor. They were speaking in low voices in the library, not realizing she was reshelving books on the upper level. What she heard made her blood run cold. They knew not that she was a spy, but that a spy was expected. They were testing her. The king had been testing her from that first moment in the throne room. She had less than a week before her cover would be blown before they confronted her, before they did something unspeakable. That night she prepared to run. She gathered her notes, prepared to make the dead drop and escape into the forest. It was her training, abort the mission, preserve the asset, get out. She was halfway to her window when the door to her room burst open. Captain Kess stood there and behind her 2 guards. Their expressions were grim. "The king requests your presence," Kess said. "Now." Ivy's heart sank, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. "Of course." They walked her through the castle, not toward the throne room but toward a chamber she'd never been in before. It was below the main level, deep in the stone. The air grew colder. The walls seemed to press in. The interrogation room was simple, a stone floor, a chair, and the king. He sat across from her, relaxed in his posture but dangerous in a way that made the air itself seem threatening. On the table between them lay her notes, the cipher. "Please," he said softly, "explain to me why the Crescent Moon Pact's intelligence asset has been spying on me for 3 weeks." There was no point in lying. He'd already played out the string of her deception, but Ivy had been trained for this too. She'd been trained to break before she broke, to give information that seemed crucial but wasn't, to survive an interrogation. "I was sent to gather intelligence on your alliance with the Eastern Territories," she said, her voice steady, "to report back to the Council on potential threats." "And did you?" "Yes." "Did you give them accurate information?" She hesitated for just a moment. "No." That seemed to surprise him. He leaned forward. "Why not?" "Because the information I was meant to gather doesn't exist," Ivy said. "Your alliance is a defensive measure, not an aggressive one. You were afraid. That's not the narrative the council wanted to hear. They sent me to find evidence of a threat so they could justify attacking you preemptively." The king was quiet for a long moment. "You're very intelligent for an Omega." "Yes," Ivy agreed. "And you lied to your handlers, protected your mark. How fascinating." He stood and began to pace. "Tell me, Ivy, do you know what happens now to spies in my castle?" "I assume you kill them." "The last 3 spies that came here were killed, yes, but I'm wondering if you might be different." He stopped in front of her. "You've been here for 3 weeks. In that time I could have ended you at any moment. Instead, I watched you work. I watched you learn the castle. I watched you protect yourself while appearing helpless. And I saw something I rarely see: integrity. Ivy's mouth went dry. You came here expecting to die, the king continued. You did your duty as you understood it, but when given the choice, you protected me, a stranger, an enemy of your pack. Why? Because it was right, Ivy said simply. He smiled, and for the first time it wasn't predatory, it was almost gentle. I have a proposal for you, Ivy, one that your pack would never believe, and neither would they allow. I want you to stay, not as a spy, as my advisor. Your Majesty. Hear me out. You're intelligent, skilled, and you have a moral compass that points to something stronger than pack loyalty. I need someone like that. Someone who can tell me when I'm wrong. Someone who isn't afraid to challenge me. He gestured to the chair. Sit. Ivy sat. There's a problem, the king said, returning to his own seat. A problem that your council doesn't understand, but you will once I explain it. The Eastern Territories alliance isn't about defending against the council, King Ashford began. It's about something far more dangerous, something that threatens all of us, vampire and shifter alike. He stood and walked to a map on the wall. It showed the region in detail, territories marked in various colors. There is a faction called the Purists. They don't recognize political boundaries. They don't care about treaties or alliances. They believe that shifters and vampires should be hunting each other to extinction, not coexisting. The Purists don't exist, Ivy said. They're a myth. That's what everyone believed about me once, the king replied. A myth told to children to frighten them, yet here I am. He pointed to a territory marked in black on the far edge of the map. They exist, and they're gathering an army. I've been trying to build a coalition of vampire clans and shifter packs strong enough to stand against them, not because I want power, because I don't want another war. Ivy processed this. If it was true, and she had no reason to doubt him now, then the council sending her to spy made a terrible kind of sense. They would see a coalition as a threat to their authority. They would want to destabilize it before it became too powerful. My council, she began. Your council wants to maintain power, the king interrupted gently. They're not evil, they're just afraid of losing control, and they're making a terrible mistake that will allow the Purists to destroy everything. Why are you telling me this? Ivy asked. Why not just kill me? Because I need an ally inside the Crescent Moon Pack, Ashford said. Someone who can make the council understand the threat, someone who understands both sides. They'll never trust me, not after this. They'll listen to you if you bring them something they want more than they want my death, he said. Intelligence on the Purist movement. Real intelligence, not the fiction they expected you to bring them. I'll give you the truth. You'll bring it home. And you'll tell them that I'm proposing not a political alliance but a war alliance, against the actual enemy. Ivy stood and paced to the map, studying the Black Territory. And if they refuse? Then the Purists will make their move within 6 months, the king said. And we'll all be too divided to stop them. So your choice isn't between staying loyal to your pack and helping me. Your choice is between helping me convince them, or being the person who watched her pack burn because she was too afraid to try. It was a compelling argument, and perhaps he sensed that she was wavering because his voice softened. I'm not asking you to betray your pack, Ivy. I'm asking you to save it. There's a difference. She turned to face him. What would staying here actually entail? What role would I have? My advisor, he said. My strategist, a voice I trust. You would have authority in my castle and my war councils. You would report directly to me. And eventually you would help me lead the coalition against the Purists. That's not a position, Ivy said. That's a crown, he finished. Not a queen's crown, not in the traditional sense, but power, real power. The ability to shape the future of this region instead of merely responding to it. Ivy looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the weariness in his ancient eyes, the weight of centuries of leadership. She saw a man, a vampire king, yes, but a man nonetheless, who was terrified of the darkness coming and desperately hoping someone would help him face it. I need time, she said, to think. You have until dawn, he replied. After that I'll need your answer, stay or go, help or don't. but decide knowing that if you go back to your council without the truth, you're choosing their deaths. Ivy didn't sleep. She sat on her balcony and watched the night unfold over the castle, listened to the sounds of guards changing shift, felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her like gravity itself. She thought about her life before this assignment. Invisible, small, meaningless in the grand scheme of things. She'd accepted that. She'd made peace with being the person no one noticed. But what if she could be more? What if she could matter? At dawn, she found the king in his private study. "I'll stay," she said, "but only if you give me the truth about the purists, all of it, and only if you let me send one message to my council. A message from me under my own authority, not as a spy but as someone who's discovered something that changes everything." The king smiled. It was a real smile, not predatory or calculating. It transformed his entire face, made him look almost boyish. Agreed. The message reached Commander Thorne 3 days later. It didn't come through a dead drop. It came openly, sealed with the king's mark, carrying Ivy's own cipher signature, a signature only Thorne would recognize. She told him everything, the purist threat, the alliance, the king's proposal. She asked him to call an emergency council meeting. She asked him to consider peace instead of war. And she told him that she was staying at Crimson Castle, not as a prisoner or a possession, but as an advisor to the king. The response took a week. When it came, it wasn't what Ivy expected. Commander Thorne himself arrived at the castle gates, along with Victoria and Marcus. They were admitted to King Ashford's throne room, where Ivy stood to his right, her hand resting on the pommel of a sword she'd been trained to use. "Your Majesty," Thorne said, offering a deep bow of respect. The king acknowledged it with an inclination of his head. "Your proposal is interesting," Thorne continued. "The council is skeptical, but we are willing to listen. However, we have conditions." "Of course," the king said, "as do I." What followed was a negotiation that lasted 3 days. In the end, a treaty was drafted. Not a surrender, not a conquest. A genuine alliance between the vampire clans and the Crescent Moon Pack, with Ivy named as liaison, a position that gave her unprecedented authority over both her original pack and her new one. The purists were defeated in a coordinated campaign that took 2 months and cost lives on both sides, but prevented a larger, more catastrophic war. In the aftermath, things changed. Ivy was formally titled as the King's Strategos, a combination of advisor, strategist and general. She moved from the guest quarters to chambers that truly belonged to her, adjacent to the king's but with her own independent space. The servants began to call her by her full name. Guards saluted her. She had a seat in the war council that couldn't be revoked. She was no longer invisible. One evening, 6 months after arriving at Crimson Castle, Ivy stood alone in the king's study while he reviewed reports from the eastern border. The war with the purists was over, but the work of establishing lasting peace was just beginning. "You've been quiet today," he observed without looking up. "I've been thinking," she replied. "About what?" "About probability. When I was sent here as a spy, the odds of survival were maybe 15%. The odds of success were even lower. The odds of ending up here doing this," she gestured to the study, to her own authority, to everything that had changed, were essentially 0. The king set down his pen and turned to face her. "And I'm wondering if I should be angry that you manipulated the situation, that you knew I'd fail as a spy but sent me down that path anyway, knowing I'd survive it because of who I was." He rose from his chair. "Are you angry?" Ivy considered. "No, confused perhaps, but not angry. You gambled on my integrity. You were right to do so." "I gambled on more than that," he said quietly. "I gambled that you would be exactly what I needed, not just as an advisor, but as someone to stand beside me in all of this, someone who understands both the darkness I come from and the light I'm trying to build." He stepped closer, and for a moment Ivy forgot that he was a vampire king, that she was an Omega from a rival pack, that 6 months ago she'd expected death. She saw only a man who was lonely in his power, just as she had been lonely in her invisibility. "Is that what I am?" she asked. "What you need?" "It's what I hoped you would be," he said. When I saw you in the throne room and realized you weren't afraid, when I watched you observe my castle with intelligence and purpose, when I found that you chose integrity over loyalty when forced to choose, you were never just a spy or an advisor to me, Ivy. You were always going to be something more. He reached out and she let him take her hand. The council wants me to make it official, he continued. They want a symbol of the alliance between our peoples. They're suggesting that I take a consort, someone who represents both the vampire world and the shifter world. Ivy's breath caught. I'm suggesting that I ask you, he said, not as a symbol, not as a political tool, but because I've come to believe that we are stronger together than we ever could be apart, because you make me better, because… Yes, Ivy interrupted. She was surprised by the word even as she said it, but she'd always been good at making the right choice when it mattered. He smiled that boyish smile again. I didn't finish my proposal. I don't need to hear the rest, she said. Yes to the alliance, yes to this, yes to whatever comes next. 1 year later, Ivy stood in a tower high above Crimson Castle, looking out over the territories that had once been divided. The purist movement was completely dismantled, the alliance held, peace, fragile and hard-won, had taken root. She wore a crown now, not because she'd been forced into one position or another, but because she'd climbed to where she could claim it. Behind her she heard footsteps. The king entered, no longer quite so distant and dangerous now that she knew him. They'd built something that went beyond political necessity, a genuine partnership, and yes, love in the way that two damaged people could love each other. The Eastern Territories are reporting full compliance with the new trade agreements, she told him, showing him the reports she'd been reviewing. Your work, he asked. Mostly, though Commander Thorne deserves credit, the Council is finally understanding that cooperation benefits everyone. The king moved to stand beside her at the window. Do you ever regret it, the path you chose? Ivy smiled. I was supposed to come here as a gift, an offering, something to be consumed and discarded. Instead, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Which is… purpose, she said. Home, belonging. I was invisible my entire life and I'd made peace with that. But with you I'm not invisible, I matter, and that changes everything. He took her hand, and they stood together watching the sun set over a world they'd had to fight to save. Ivy had expected death when she arrived at Crimson Castle. She'd received a crown instead, not a crown of jewels and gold, but something more valuable. The crown of choosing her own destiny, of standing equal beside a king, of being seen and valued and loved. Sometimes the greatest revolutions happened not with swords and blood, but with single moments of recognition between two people who understood what it meant to be underestimated, and to choose to rise above it anyway. And sometimes the strongest alliances were forged not in treaties and formal agreements, but in the quiet moments between, when a spy and a king discovered they were exactly what each other needed. The story of how an Omega spy caught spying on the vampire king expected death, but received a crown, it was, in the end, a love story, just not the kind anyone could have predicted. She expected death, but the king gave her a crown. Now she must choose, remain a spy for her pack or stand beside a king to save them all. If this story touches your heart, you're going to love what's waiting on my Patreon. Get access to exclusive stories, character backstories, alternate endings, and join a community of fans who can't get enough of supernatural romance. Your support helps me create more magic. Link in bio. Go and watch exclusive stories.